The scent of mildew and dried lavender hung heavy in the attic air as Clara pushed the last box aside. Her hands trembled, not from the chill rising from the worn floorboards, but from the strange feeling that had been with her since she arrived in Havenwood 3 days before. It was as if the very air of the village whispered secrets she couldn't decipher, a low, constant melody that vibrated in her bones. Her grandmother Adelaide's house had remained untouched for almost 3 decades. Her mother, Helen, had never spoken about the reason for its abandonment, only repeating that some wounds never heal whenever Clara asked about her maternal family. Now, with Helen buried just a month ago, Clara found herself facing an inheritance that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The attic stretched before her like a museum of forgotten memories. Dark wooden chests held clothes that smelled of sandalwood and cinnamon. Glass jars contained dried herbs whose names she didn't recognize. And in the farthest corner, wrapped in cloths stained with melted wax and something that looked like dried blood, was the journal. Clara hesitated before touching it. Her hands, which had held her dying mother's without trembling, now faltered before this simple object. The leather of the cover was cracked like parched skin, and as she opened it, the paper crackled like dead leaves. Adelaide's handwriting was firm, almost masculine, but the words danced before Clara's eyes, as if written in water. November 15th, 1990. The voice returned tonight. It calls from the roots, whispers among the stones. Margaret says it's time. Selma agrees, but I sense something wrong in the woods, something that stirs where there should be silence. Clara turned the page, her heart beating erratically. The writing became progressively more erratic, the words sprawling across the page as if written during tremors. We found the marks, burned into the altar stone like scars that refuse to heal. The cracked mirror reflects things that aren't there. The flower wilts before it's even picked. The black candle melts against the wind. The signs are all wrong, but it's too late to turn back. The attic air seemed to thicken with each word. Clara felt the weight of family history pressing on. Her lungs, a legacy of secrets her mother had tried to bury by moving her to the big city when she was only 5. But there were fragments of memory that her urban upbringing hadn't erased. The sound of women singing at dawn, the smell of burning herbs, the feeling of something immense and ancient watching from the shadows of the woods. November 23rd, last entry. If anyone finds this diary, know that we did what needed to be done. The ritual isn't to awaken, it's to seal. She comes cyclically, and we are the guardians. But something changed this time. The earth groans differently. The trees bend as if fleeing something, and I dream of my granddaughter, a girl with dark eyes who calls to me across time. Clara. If you are reading this, it may already be too late for all of us. Clara dropped the journal, the sound echoing through the attic like a gunshot. Her hands trembled violently now, and a deep nausea rose from her stomach. The name written there, her own identity intertwined with the mystery that had swallowed her grandmother, made every cell in her body vibrate at a strange frequency. She stumbled down the stairs, the diary clutched to her chest. The house felt different now, as if the walls had absorbed her discoveries and reconfigured themselves in response. Shadows fell at angles that didn't make sense, and the creak of the floorboards sounded like whispers in an unknown tongue. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw 3 women in white walking through the woods, their figures dissolving into the mist like ghosts that had never existed. And in the back of her mind, a woman's voice called her name with a familiarity that made her bones ache. The next morning, she called Joanna. "You need to come here," Clara said, her voice hoarse from a sleepless night. "I found something about my grandmother, about what happened in 1990. Joanna Miller had been her best friend in childhood, before the move to a big city separated their lives. Now an archaeologist, a career she defined as unearthing truths nobody wants to remember, she had lost her academic credibility 2 years earlier by insisting on the existence of pre-Columbian cults in rural America. Clara knew Joanna wouldn't refuse the opportunity to investigate a real mystery. "Clara, are you okay? Your voice sounds..." Joanna paused. "Different. Please, I need someone who understands these things, and bring Olivia too, if you can convince her." Olivia Davis completed their childhood trio of friends. A nurse at City General Hospital, she represented the voice of reason Clara felt she needed at that moment. If something real was happening in Havenwood, Olivia would be able to distinguish between genuine phenomena and hallucinations caused by the stress of recent loss. They arrived the following afternoon, driving Joanna's car, a dusty white Corolla, from their 5-hour drive from the city. Clara waited for them on the porch of Adelaide's house, the diary open in her lap, its pages trembling in the mountain breeze. "Jesus Christ, Clara," Olivia said when she saw her. "When was the last time you slept?" Clara knew how she must look. Deep shadows marked her face, and her hands hadn't stopped trembling since she read the last entry of the diary. But there was something more, a change in her posture, in the way her eyes moved, as if she were constantly listening to sounds the others couldn't hear. Joanna climbed the porch steps and sat beside Clara, her archaeologist's eyes already analyzing the details of the old house. "Tell me everything," she said simply. Clara recounted her discovery, reading excerpts from the diary aloud. As she spoke, she sensed the words gaining weight in the evening air, as if uttering them were an act of invocation. Olivia maintained a skeptical expression, but Joanna leaned forward, absorbing every detail. "Sealing ritual," Joanna murmured when Clara finished. "I've heard of this in some cultures. The idea that certain entities or forces need to be contained periodically, or they manifest in the physical world." "Joanna, are you serious?" Olivia crossed her arms. "Clara lost her mother a month ago. She's obviously in shock and found a diary with the rambling writings of a woman who probably suffered from some mental disorder." "What about the 3 women who disappeared?" Clara asked, her voice firmer than she expected. "Do you think that was delusion too?" Olivia hesitated. The disappearance of the 3 women was historical fact in Havenwood, documented even in the regional newspapers of the time. But there was something about the way Clara spoke, a disturbing certainty that made Olivia question her own rationalist convictions. "Let's assume you're right," Olivia finally said. "What do you intend to do? Recreate the ritual?" The silence that followed was as thick as the fog that was beginning to rise from the surrounding forests. Clara looked at the diary in her lap, the yellowed pages seeming to pulse with their own light in the approaching twilight. "Yes," she said, the word escaping her lips before she could censor it. "I need to know what happened to them. I need to understand why my grandmother wrote my name in this diary before I was even born." Joanna nodded slowly. "If we're going to do this, we need to prepare adequately. Study every word of the diary, map the locations mentioned, understand the symbols." "You two have lost your minds," Olivia said, but her voice lacked conviction. There was something in the atmosphere of Havenwood that corroded even her scientific mindset. A feeling that the normal laws of reality operated differently in that place forgotten by time. They spent the next 3 days immersed in the study of the diary. Joanna made detailed notes on each symbol mentioned, while Olivia, attempting to maintain some objectivity, documented the logical inconsistencies and possible rational explanations for the events described. Clara, in turn, felt increasingly connected to her grandmother's words. It was as if each page read unlocked ancestral memories in her blood, knowledge she didn't know she possessed. She began to dream of the forest, walking paths she had never traversed but intimately recognized. On the third day, they found the first markings. Following the diary's directions, they walked through the woods surrounding Havenwood until they found a small, circular clearing where 3 large stones formed a perfect triangle. On the surface of each stone, engraved as if by burning iron, were markings that corresponded exactly to the drawings in Adelaide's notebook. "My God," Joanna whispered, kneeling before one of the stones. "This is real. The markings are ancient, but they've been reactivated recently. Look how discolored the stone around them is." Olivia examined the engravings with the skepticism of someone searching for logical explanations, but even she couldn't deny the evidence before her eyes. The markings were too deep to have been made by conventional tools, and the geometric precision suggested advanced mathematical knowledge. "There's more," Clara said, consulting the diary. "Adelaide mentions letters hidden in abandoned tombs. There's an old cemetery on the outskirts of the village." The Havenwood Cemetery was a forgotten place, overgrown with vegetation and abandoned. Since a new cemetery was built in the 1970s, cracked headstones emerged from the earth like broken teeth, and many graves had been opened and looted over the years. Following the diary's instructions, they found the tomb of Esperanza Santos, dated 1847. The headstone was broken in half, and in the crack, wrapped in waterproof plastic, was a letter. Clara opened it with trembling hands. The handwriting was different from Adelaide's, older, more formal. "To the one who will come after us. The cycle completes every 28 years. We are the guardians, but we are also the sacrifice. The entity that sleeps in the roots of this land needs to be fed or contained. We chose to contain. But if you are reading this, perhaps our choice has failed. The objects are keys, the cracked mirror shows what was, the dried flower represents what is, the black candle illuminates what will be. Use them wisely." Esperanza Santos, 1875. 1875, Joanna murmured. 28 years before 1903. And Adelaide disappeared in 1990, another 28 years later. "And now it's 2018, Clara finished, the realization falling upon her like ice water. Another 28 years. That night, back at Adelaide's house, the inexplicable events began. First were the clocks, all the timepieces in the house, from the old wall clock to Clara's cell phone, stopped at exactly 11:17 p.m. The silence that followed was so complete that they could hear their own heartbeats. Then came the sounds. Footsteps in the attic when they were all in the living room, whispers in the walls, as if voices were conversing within the wood, and most disturbing, the sound of women singing a melody that Clara recognized from her deepest dreams. "Do you hear that?" Olivia asked, her voice a mere whisper. The 3 exchanged glances. The singing seemed to come from all directions at once, a feminine harmony that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. It was beautiful and terrifying, familiar and utterly alien. Joanna was the first to move, heading to the window. Look. Outside, in the forest, small lights danced among the trees. They weren't electric lights. They pulsed like candles flickering in the wind, forming patterns that seemed deliberate, almost as if they were spelling out words in some lost alphabet. "We need to go there," Clara said, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. "Clara, no." Olivia grabbed her arm. "Whatever's happening, it's not safe." But Clara was already moving, driven by an instinct that seemed to come from a primal part of her brain. She grabbed the diary and headed for the door, her friends scrambling after her. The forest at night was a completely different world. Fog had rolled down from the mountains, shrouding everything in a white veil that distorted sounds and shapes. The lights they had seen from the window now seemed farther away, always receding as they approached. "We're being guided," Joanna realized. "The lights are leading us somewhere specific." They walked for almost an hour, following trails that Clara knew. Somehow her grandmother had walked decades before. The forest seemed to recognize her, branches parting to let her pass, rocks providing just the right foothold where she needed it. Finally, they reached the clearing. It was larger than Clara expected, perfectly circular, as if carved into the forest by gigantic hands. In the center were the same 3 stones they had found during the day, but now they radiated a subtle light, as if warmed by an inner fire. And around the clearing, spectral figures of women in white robes walked in a circle, their translucent forms passing through the trees without interrupting their rhythmic movement. "Jesus Christ," Olivia whispered. "What is this?" "They're trapped," Clara said, understanding dawning on her like a revelation. "Trapped in the ritual. They've been walking in a circle for 28 years. One of the figures stopped and turned toward them. Even translucent, Clara recognized the face immediately. Adelaide, her grandmother, exactly as in old photographs, but with an expression of desperate urgency. Adelaide's figure pointed to the center of the clearing, where 3 objects had appeared on the central stone: a cracked mirror, a withered flower, and a black candle. "She wants us to finish the ritual," Joanna realized. "Or undo it," Clara corrected. That's when the storm began. Lightning slashed across the cloudless sky, and an impossible wind swept through the clearing, bending the trees as if they were fleeing something. The spectral figures began to move faster, their circle tightening toward the center. "Something's wrong," Olivia shouted over the roar of the wind. "They're trying to warn us about something." Clara looked at her spectral grandmother and saw terror in her translucent eyes. Adelaide wasn't pointing at the objects. She was pointing to something behind them. Clara turned and saw the shadow. It was larger than a person, denser than the surrounding darkness, and moved with deliberate purpose toward the clearing. As it approached, the temperature plummeted, and the air became so thick that breathing became a conscious effort. "Run!" Adelaide whispered, her voice echoing directly into Clara's mind. "Run while you can." But Clara didn't run. Instead, she moved toward the 3 objects in the center of the clearing. Her hands closed around the cracked mirror, and immediately her vision fragmented into 1,000 different reflections. In the mirror, she saw the past. Adelaide, Margaret, and Selma, performing the original ritual, their faces etched with terror as they realized they had made a terrible mistake. The ritual wasn't meant to seal the entity, it was meant to release it, and they had realized too late. She saw the present, herself and her friends in the clearing, surrounded by forces they didn't fully understand, about to repeat the same mistake. And she saw the future. Havenwood consumed by supernatural darkness, the entity finally free to manifest in the physical world, feeding not only on the village but spreading like a plague across the country. "Clara!" Joanna screamed. "Your hand!" Clara looked down and saw that her hand holding the mirror was bleeding, the cracked glass cutting her palm. But the blood wasn't falling to the ground. It was being absorbed by the mirror, which began to glow with red light. The withered flower in her other hand began to bloom, petals unfolding to reveal something unnatural, small black eyes blinking at its center. And the black candle lit itself, its flame casting shadows that moved independently of the objects, creating them. The giant shadow had reached the edge of the clearing now, and Clara could feel its ancient hunger, a hunger that had waited 28 years to be satisfied. The spectral figures of the women began to scream, a sound that didn't come from their mouths, but emanated directly from the earth beneath Clara's feet. That's when she understood. The ritual had never been about sealing or releasing the entity. It was about choice. Every 28 years, the Guardians had to choose, sacrifice 3 women to keep the entity dormant, or find another way to protect the world from its influence. Adelaide, Margaret, and Selma had chosen to sacrifice themselves, trapping themselves in a time loop to prevent the entity from fully awakening. But their sacrifice had only delayed the inevitable. The entity continued to grow in power, and now it needed more than 3 lives to be contained. "I understand now," Clara said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised her friends. "You two need to get out of here, now." "Clara, no!" Olivia began to protest. "Go!" Clara yelled, and her voice echoed with a power that made the trees themselves bow. "If you stay, we'll all die, and the entity will be released. If I stay alone, I can try something different." Joanna grabbed Olivia's arm. "She's right. There's something in her bloodline. Something we don't have. Let's go." They ran from the clearing, but Clara knew they wouldn't get far. The forest wouldn't let them escape easily. Alone now, with the ritual objects and the growing presence of the entity, Clara closed her eyes and did something her city upbringing had almost erased. She prayed, not to God or saints, but to the women who came before her, to the ancestral wisdom that ran in her blood. Then a fourth voice joined the spectral chorus, her mother, Helen. "You don't need to sacrifice yourself," Helen said, appearing as a luminous figure beside Adelaide. "There's another way." "Mom?" Clara cried. "How are you here?" "I died, protecting you from this," Helen explained. "But now I see that trying to protect you only delayed the inevitable. You need to break the cycle, not perpetuate it." "How?" Helen pointed to the 3 objects. "Use them not as keys to seal or release, but as bridges. The entity isn't malevolent, it's just lost, separated from its source. It needs to go home." Clara understood. The entity wasn't a demon or destructive force. It was part of the earth itself, displaced from its resting place by some ancient event. Attempts to seal it or control it had only increased its desperation and power. She lifted the cracked mirror. Instead of trying to control what she saw in its reflections, she allowed all the visions to flow through her, past, present, and future, mingling in a singular understanding of what the entity truly was. The withered flower in her hand wasn't a symbol of death, but of transformation. She allowed it to bloom fully, revealing not malevolent eyes, but an alien beauty representing life in ways the human mind struggled to comprehend. And the black candle. Clara blew out its flame, but instead of extinguishing, it transformed into a pure white light that illuminated the entire clearing. The giant shadow halted its approach. For the first time in decades, Clara could sense not hunger or rage emanating from the entity, but confusion and relief. "You want to go home," Clara said, addressing the shadowy presence directly. "You don't belong on this plane of existence, and we have no right to keep you here." The answer came not in words, but in images that flooded Clara's mind. She saw the entity in its original state, a benevolent natural force, guardian of the regions. Telluric energies. She saw how colonizers had disturbed its rest with practices they didn't understand, forcing it into a painful state of existence between worlds. She saw how generations of women had tried to deal with the problem, their good intentions only complicating the situation. And she saw how now, finally, someone was willing to try something different. Clara raised the 3 objects high. "I release you," she said. "Not to this world, but to your world. Go in peace." What happened next defied all description. The candlelight expanded to engulf the entire clearing. The mirror no longer reflected images of time, but opened rifts in the air through which Clara could see other planes of existence, and the flower transformed into something like a star, pulsing with energy that made the very fabric of reality vibrate. The giant shadow began to move toward the rifts opened by the mirror, but as it passed Clara, it paused briefly. For a moment, she felt a gratitude so profound and ancient that it brought tears to her eyes. Then the entity vanished through the rifts and the mirror shattered completely. Clara collapsed, the objects falling from her hands. Around the clearing, the spectral figures of the women began to dissolve, their faces showing peace for the first time in decades. Adelaide approached Clara one last time. "Thank you, my granddaughter," she said, her voice like wind through leaves. "You did what none of us were brave enough to attempt." "Grandma, wait." Clara tried to rise. "There's so much I want to know." "You will discover it in your own time," Adelaide smiled. "The lineage continues, but now, free from the burden we carried. Live your life, Clara. Live without the weight of our mistakes." The spectral figures faded like smoke, and Clara found herself alone in the clearing. The storm had ceased, and for the first time since arriving in Havenwood, she could hear the normal sounds of the forest, crickets, wind in the leaves, life following its natural course. That's how Joanna and Olivia found her an hour later, unconscious in the center of the clearing, clutching fragments of the shattered mirror. They had tried to leave the forest, but found that all the trails led them back to the clearing as if the woods themselves insisted they witness what had happened. "Clara!" Olivia knelt beside her friend, checking her vital signs. "She's okay, but something's strange." "What?" Joanna asked. "Her body temperature is normal, but she should be hypothermic after being exposed for so long." Clara slowly opened her eyes, a smile touching her lips. "We did it," she whispered. "She went home." They helped her to her feet, and that's when Joanna made the most disturbing discovery. "Clara," she said, pointing to an area of the clearing, covered in leaves. "What's that?" Clara looked and saw rectangular shapes under the fallen leaves. They pushed aside the vegetation and revealed 3 ancient graves, the headstones so worn by time that the names were barely legible. But at the base of each headstone, carved as if freshly done, were symbols that exactly matched those in Adelaide's journal. And beside the 3 graves, there was a 4th grave, open but empty, and on the headstone carved in clear new lettering, Clara Helen Santos, guardian who broke the cycle. "This can't be here," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "That headstone wasn't here before." Clara touched the stone and felt it warm, as if it had just been carved. But she felt no fear. Instead, a profound understanding settled in her mind. "We don't need the graves anymore," she said. "The cycle is broken. The guardians are free." That's when Joanna made the second discovery. "Girls," she said, her voice strange, "check your pockets." Clara reached into her jacket pocket and found folded pages. Pages she recognized instantly as from Adelaide's diary, but pages she knew for certain hadn't been there before. Olivia and Joanna had also found pages in their pockets. Clara unfolded hers and read, "To Clara, who had courage where we failed. What you did freed not only the entity, but all of us. But know that Havenwood has been altered by your choice. The veil between worlds has been weakened here. Some things that shouldn't exist can now pass through. You will be called again, but not as a guardian, as a protector, and when that happens, you will not be alone." Joanna's page contained symbols and maps she'd never seen, but that her archaeologist's mind recognized as ancient and significant. Olivia's listed symptoms and treatments for conditions she knew didn't exist in conventional medicine, but that her intuition told her would be needed soon. "What does this mean?" Olivia asked. Clara folded the page and tucked it into her pocket. "That our adventure is just beginning." They tried to leave Havenwood that morning, but found the road had been swallowed by the forest overnight. Gigantic. Trees had grown through the asphalt as if they'd been there for decades, and there was no sign that a road had ever existed there. "How are we going to get out of here?" Olivia asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Clara consulted the page she'd found in her pocket. There was a hand-drawn map on the back, showing a trail through the woods that she knew hadn't existed the day before. "This way," she said, pointing to an opening in the trees that definitely hadn't been there before. The trail snaked through the forest like a fresh scar on the landscape. As they walked, Clara felt Havenwood bidding them farewell, or perhaps preparing them for something greater. Branches parted from their path with almost reverent deference, and small flowers bloomed on the ground where she stepped. "Clara," Joanna said, noticing the phenomenon, "do you realize what's happening around you?" Clara stopped and looked back. The trail they had walked was gradually closing, the trees moving in slow motion to obliterate any sign of their passage. Havenwood is protecting itself, she realized. Now that the cycle has been broken, the village needs to hide until it's ready for the outside world again. They walked for hours through a forest that seemed to rewrite itself around them. Landscapes shifted when they weren't directly looking, and Clara was sure they were covering far more distance than should be physically possible. Finally, they emerged onto the main highway, miles from where they'd parked the car, but Joanna's Corolla was there, waiting as if it had been magically transported. "This is impossible," Olivia murmured, checking the odometer. "The car hasn't been moved, but Havenwood brought the road to us," Clara finished. During the drive back to the big city, they tried to process what had happened. Olivia insisted on logical explanations that sounded increasingly hollow as the evidence mounted. Joanna made frantic notes about symbols and phenomena that defied everything she thought she knew about archaeology and history. Clara, in turn, felt a fundamental shift in her being. It was as if the ritual in the clearing had unlocked something in her DNA, activating ancestral knowledge that had been dormant. She knew things now, about plants that grew only under specific moons, about stones that sang when touched the right way, about how certain words could alter reality when spoken with sufficient intent. 3 weeks later, back to her routine, in the big city, Clara received a call that would change everything again. Clara Santos. The voice was female, older, with an accent she couldn't place. "My name is Dr. Hope Oliveira. I am a descendant of Hope Santos, the woman whose tomb you found in Havenwood." Clara almost dropped the phone. "How do you know about this?" "Because I've been waiting for your call for 28 years. My great-grandmother left me very specific instructions on what to do when the cycle was broken. And now that it has happened, we need to talk." They met at a discreet cafe downtown. Dr. Hope was a woman of about 60, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets from several lifetimes. She placed an antique portfolio on the table between them. "Havenwood wasn't the only place where cycles like this existed," she began. "There are dozens of locations across the country, all connected by a network of telluric energy that our ancestors understood, but which was disrupted by colonization and urbanization." Clara opened the portfolio and found detailed maps of the country, marked with symbols she recognized from Adelaide's diary. Each mark represented a location where guardians had performed similar rituals, trying to keep ancient forces in balance. "But you did something different in Havenwood," Dr. Hope continued. "Instead of trying to control or seal, you chose to understand and release. That sent ripples through the entire network." "Ripples?" Clara asked, although a part of her already knew the answer. "Other cycles are breaking. Other entities are awakening. Some benevolent, others less so. And they will all need someone like you to help them find their way." Clara looked at the maps, seeing locations scattered from the Amazon to Rio Grande do Sul. In each, there was a similar story. Women who disappeared, rituals that went wrong, mysteries that remained unsolved for generations. "You're telling me I have a responsibility to all these places?" "I'm telling you that you have a gift," Dr. Hope smiled, "and that there are others like you, descendants of other guardian lineages, who are awakening to their own powers now, that the network is reactivating. Clara thought of Joanna and her impossible archaeological discoveries, of Olivia and her intuitive knowledge of medical conditions that shouldn't exist. They too had been changed by Havenwood. We don't have to do this alone, she realized. Exactly, a community is forming, a new kind of guardian for a new era, no longer bound by ancient rituals and fear, but free to use ancestral wisdom in ways our ancestors never imagined. Dr. Hope stood to leave, but paused at the cafe door. There's one more thing, Clara. Havenwood still exists, but not on the same plane of reality as before. You can return there when you need to. Just follow the dreams you'll begin having soon. That night, Clara dreamt for the first time of the new Havenwood. The village had transformed into something between memory and possibility. The houses were the same, but built from materials that seemed made of solidified light. The forest grew through the streets in perfect harmony with the architecture, and people she recognized from old photographs walked the streets as if they'd never died. Adelaide waited for her on the porch of the family home, but now she was no longer a trapped specter. She was vibrant, real, and smiled with the joy of someone who had finally found peace. "Welcome to what Havenwood was always meant to be," Adelaide said, embracing her granddaughter. "A place where time works differently, where the boundaries between life and death are more fluid, where ancient wisdom can coexist with infinite possibilities." Clara looked around and saw other women, Margaret, Selma, Hope Santos, dozens of others she didn't recognize, but knew to be her spiritual ancestors. "You're all here? We're everywhere we're needed," Adelaide explained. "Havenwood has become a hub, a meeting point between worlds. When you need guidance, you can come here. When others need help, you can bring them here." Clara awoke with tears in her eyes and the taste of mountain air in her mouth. Beside her bed was a flower she knew didn't exist in the physical world. Its petals were translucent like glass, but radiated warmth as if made of captured light. In the months that followed, Clara began receiving calls from people across the country. A woman in Minas Gerais, whose grandfather had disappeared under mysterious circumstances during a healing ritual. A man in the Amazon whose family had guarded a generations-old artifact that had begun behaving strangely. A child in Rio Grande do Sul who drew complex symbols she shouldn't know. Each case led Clara, Joanna, and Olivia to a new location where the ancestral network was reactivating. On each trip, they learned more about their own gifts and the responsibility they had inherited. Joanna discovered she could read the history of ancient objects by touching them, seeing not only how they were used, but the intentions and emotions of those who created them. Olivia developed an ability to diagnose not only physical illnesses, but spiritual and energetic wounds that conventional medicine didn't even recognize. And Clara learned that her gift wasn't just to communicate with displaced entities, but to serve as a bridge between worlds, helping not only lost creatures find their way home, but also lost people find their place in the larger cosmos. The 6 women worked together to solve the mystery of the farm, discovering that the missing family hadn't died, but had been taken to a parallel dimension by an entity that wasn't malevolent, just confused about the differences between planes of existence. The rescue required all 6 to combine their gifts, creating a stable bridge between dimensions that allowed the family to return after decades of absence. For them, only a few hours had passed, but they returned with knowledge of alternate realities that would revolutionize Clara's scientific understanding of the universe. "We are stronger together," Clara realized as they watched the family reunite. With descendants they thought they'd never see again. "And there are more of us," added Victoria. "The network is awakening guardians all over the world. What you started in Havenwood is only the beginning." That night, the 6 women sat around a campfire and shared their stories. Each had lost someone important, a mother, grandmother, mentor, who had carried ancestral knowledge. Each had discovered their gifts through trauma and necessity, and each had chosen to use those gifts to help others instead of hiding from the world. "We're creating something new," Joanna said, gazing at the stars. "We're no longer guardians in the old sense, bound by rituals and obligations we don't understand. We are active healers, consciously choosing how to use our gifts." It was Olivia who articulated what they were all thinking. "We are the first of our kind, the first women with these gifts who have real freedom to decide what to do with them." Clara nodded, feeling the weight and freedom of that realization. She thought of Adelaide and the other women trapped in cycles they hadn't chosen, forced to sacrifice themselves to maintain a balance no one truly understood. "We broke the cycle," she said. "Now it's up to us to decide what to build in its place." 6 months later, Clara returned to Havenwood for the first time since the ritual. But now she didn't need to travel physically. She simply closed her eyes in her apartment in a big city and followed the dream path she'd learned to navigate. The dream, Havenwood, had grown. The village now stretched across valleys that didn't exist in physical reality, and people from all corners of the world walked its impossible streets. Guardians from African, Asian, European, and indigenous lineages, all connected by the same ancestral network that had been reactivated by what Clara had done in the clearing. Adelaide waited for her on the porch, as always, but now she wasn't alone. Helen was there too, along with women Clara recognized from family photographs and others she knew to be spiritual ancestors of her new, expanded family. "I'm proud of you," Adelaide said, hugging Clara. "You didn't just break the cycle, you planted the seeds of something entirely new." "What happens now?" Clara asked. "Now you write your own story," Helen replied. "No predetermined rituals, no mandatory sacrifices, no endlessly repeating cycles. You have complete freedom to decide how to use your gifts." Clara looked around the expanded Havenwood and saw the infinite potential that stretched before her and the other guardians. There were challenges ahead, entities that would need help, mysteries that would require solutions, people seeking healing for wounds that conventional medicine couldn't touch. But for the first time since she'd found Adelaide's diary in the dusty attic, Clara felt she was exactly where she needed to be. "There's one last thing," Adelaide said, handing Clara an object she hadn't seen before, a small mirror, perfectly intact, without a single crack. "This is the true mirror. What you broke in the clearing was just a reflection, a shadow of the real thing." Clara took the mirror and saw not only her own reflection, but glimpses of all the other guardians around the world, each facing their own challenges, each contributing to the new network that was forming. "Use it when you need to find us," Adelaide instructed. "And when the big decisions come, and they will, remember that you don't have to choose between sealing and releasing. There's always a third option: understanding." Clara woke up in her apartment with the mirror still in her hands and an absolute certainty that her true journey was just beginning. The phone rang almost immediately. "Clara?" It was a child's voice, but laden with a maturity that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "My name is Anna. I'm 8 years old, and I think I need your help. There are things growing in my backyard that shouldn't exist, and my grandmother told me to look for the woman who broke the cycle of Havenwood." Clara smiled, tucking the mirror into her pocket. "Where do you live, Anna?" "Oro Preto. But the things in my backyard, they're not of this dimension." "I'll be there tomorrow," Clara promised, "and don't worry, you're not alone." After hanging up, Clara looked out the window of her apartment at the city stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Joanna was cataloging impossible artifacts in her lab, Olivia was treating patients with symptoms that defied all medical logic. And around the world, other women were awakening to gifts their families had guarded for generations. The ancestral network hadn't just been reactivated, it had evolved. And for the first time in history, the Guardians had complete freedom to decide how to use their power. Clara grabbed her travel bag and began making plans for Ouro Preto. There was a child who needed help, and probably a new piece of the larger puzzle she and her companions were assembling. The mirror in her pocket pulsed gently, and for a moment she could swear she heard the distant sound of women singing, not in lament or despair, but in pure celebration and ancestral joy. The cycle had been broken. The network had been rebuilt. And for the first time in centuries, the Guardians were truly free. Clara smiled, locked her apartment, and went downstairs to face whatever mystery awaited her in Ouro Preto. Behind her, invisible but always present, the women of Havenwood walked beside her, no longer bound by ancient rituals, but finally free to guide the next generations toward a future none of them had dared to imagine. And somewhere between the big city and Ouro Preto, in a dimension that existed only in dreams and ancestral memory, Havenwood continued to grow, a refuge for all. The women who carried the weight of ancient wisdom and the responsibility of shaping the future. The end was, in truth, only the beginning.